Our next speaker is Thomas Pollet from the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and he will be bringing us back to the human scale with his
Hi, I'm Thomas Pollet. As you said, I'm a psychologist. Well, I'm in a psychology department, but I work on evolutionary psychology, and I'll be discussing some criticisms on cross-cultural correlations and what people have tended to infer from them on human nature. And this is some work which I've been doing with my collaborators, Josh Tybur, Williem Frankenhuis, Ian Rickard. But of course, any mistakes which I'll tell you are my own, so don't blame them. So what we're dealing here, what I will talk about today is cross-cultural correlations. And these have to do with correlations between aggregated variables. So basically, you go out and measure everything at a nation or a state or a province level, then you aggregate those data and you correlate that to a different set of aggregates. So that's what I will be talking about, cross-cultural correlations. And in my view, they're becoming increasingly popular in the field of evolution and human behavior, which is where I work in. And I think there's an increase in papers relying on cross-cultural correlations or cross-state correlations. I'll be using these terms, cross-regional correlations, sort of interchangeably. They all point to the same thing. So basically, you have some aggregate variables being correlated with some other aggregated variables. But they're not individual level correlations. That's the key point. And what we did, we did a rather small literature research, basically with the search terms cross-cultural and cross-regional in these type of journals. And if the word cross-cultural or cross-regional was in the abstract, it provided a hit. And then we checked if it had at least one of the issues, which I'll be talking to you about today, to show that it's non-trivial and it actually happens across quite some different areas. And just to show you, and I won't go into detail in discussing all these examples, but just to show you the range of topics for which people have invoked evidence from cross-cultural correlations on human nature. You might be familiar, and this is probably the largest clump, which is the pathogen stress hypothesis. And basically, a group surrounding Randy Thornhill and Corey Fincher, they use macro-level cross-cultural correlations to show things like this, where every data point is a nation, and you basically find an association between some measure of parasite stress and some other variable. In this case, it's in-group assortativeness. And the rationale behind this is that if you're in a high pathogen environment, you would avoid outgroups because they might be carrying unknown pathogens, and you already have a lower immune system, so you avoid those groups. So you'd be more focused on your own group and be more skeptical or avoid outgroups. And every dot here is a nation, and you get some aggregate measure of like the parasite or the historical parasite level, and some measure for assortativeness. And you find a nice, positive, strong relationship between those two traits. You can also do this for something like religion. Some people have also used, again, I don't have time to discuss all these papers in detail, so I just want to show you the range. Some people have correlated the health of a nation, so basically how healthy it is, with perceived preferences for masculinity. Again, masculinity would be immunocompetence handicap, and in a high pathogen environment, women would prefer more masculized faces because they're evidence that you manage to carry this handicap in this pathogen environment. And this is the same argument, but then based on state level rather than on nation level. Now, in a completely different field like sex ratio biasing and the Tybur hypothesis, which you might be familiar with, people have also used this type of arguments. And this paper argues for a relationship between mortality rates and sex ratio at birth in humans. So also presenting cross-cultural correlations as evidence for individual level patterns. You also find this, but perhaps in the opposite way, in intelligence research. So, for example, Satoshi Kanazawa argues that there's a positive relationship between IQ at state level, at US state level, and wealth of the states. The inference being that more intelligent people earn higher wages, hence, on average, more intelligent states should be wealthier. So that's the argument. And again, there's a paper on pathogen stress arguing for a negative relationship between IQ and pathogen load. Again, a very different topic, life history theory. Also here in this area, people have put forward macro-level cross-cultural correlations. And this paper by Jonathan Wells, it's not all that readable, basically argues for a relationship between sexual size dimorphism and sexual dimorphism in body composition as a function of long-term and short-term energy supply. So again, a very different topic. And again, individuals relying on macro-level data. Even in the area of mate choice, some people have argued that there would be a relationship between subsistence mode and parental arrangement of marriages. So the degree to which parents are involved in arranging the mate choice of their children. And again, this paper relies on macro-level correlations. Even for homosexual preferences, people have presented evidence, again at national level, for an association between homosexual preferences and hypergeny, social stratification. So you have an individual level trait being aggregated and then correlated with some other characteristic. And finally, one example of pair bonding. So this paper uses macro-level correlations to show an association between pair bonding and lactation in humans. So across a wide variety of fields, people have drawn inferences about, across many different examples, they draw inferences about the individual level adaptations based on aggregate data coming from a region, nation, state, or province. And of course, I've heard people talking about 9 or 13 levels. I won't go this far, I only have 3 levels. But I think what is happening and what is useful in the field of evolutionary and behavior is to distinguish at least these 3 levels. There might be many more, which I've not plotted here. But we should be quite careful in mixing up these levels and going from one level to another, and also take into account that there might be cross-level interactions, that there might be between group differences which might interact to lead to individual processes. So, and my impression is that research relying predominantly on cross-cultural correlations mixes up many of these levels and ignores some of the interactions between these levels. So just to get to the point, what are the issues that we have with using cross-cultural correlations? I'm going to focus on 3, there are many more, but I'll focus on the ecological fallacy, non-independence, and equivalency of measurement. And let's start with ecological fallacy. Or some of you might know some of you might know a related phenomenon, the Simpson's paradox. You might be more acquainted with that. They're not exactly the same, but they're related. So the ecological fallacy was first framed by sociologists, and ecological is quite an unfortunate term. It has little to do with ecology, but in epidemiology and sociology, the term sort of stuck. It has actually not a lot to do with ecology at all. And in this paper, Robinson showed that there's a correlation at state level between migration status and literacy, but that relationship is reversed when you look at the individual level. And this is the original reference if you're interested. So this is the paper from 1950 in American Sociological Review. So we simulated some data just to illustrate this pattern. So imagine that every dot is a state or a nation or whatnot, but some aggregate level. And we find a positive association at the macro level between proportion of migrants and literacy scores. And from this, you could wrongfully infer that migrants should be more literate than locals. But that, of course, that doesn't have to be the case. And that's exactly what you find if you look at the individual level data. You find actually that the gap between the locals and the migrants is the highest in the proportion with the highest, in the state with the highest proportion of migrants. So you would wrongfully infer from one level that relationships also exist at another level. So you get an unwarranted inference of a relationship from one level to the other level, and it's important, so basically you have a covariance of variables within a state, individual level traits, and that's what you're interested in, but you're actually taking along covariances of things between states are included as well, and that leads to this spurious association at the macro level. If that didn't convince you, let me just give you another example which has to do with meat consumption. So it's well documented that gross domestic product is positively correlated with meat consumption. So if you take GDP as Speedy did, you find this is a log-log plot, you find a nice positive association between meat consumption per capita and GDP per capita. And from this, you would wrongfully infer that within states, within the UK, for example, within Belgium, richer regions would consume more meat on average than poor regions. But this inference is not warranted. Actually, if you look at UK data, the English on average consume less meat than the Welsh or the Scottish. And for my country, for Belgium, the Flemish consume on average less meat than the Walloons, even though we're the more affluent region of Belgium. So you cannot simply take this macro-level pattern, which you find at country level, and then stick it to the regional level. We might also wrongfully infer that richer households, and this again makes quite sense, you might also infer that richer households would consume more meat than poorer households, but again, this inference is unwarranted. It might be very well the case that it holds in countries like Gabon, but again, in the UK or Belgium, the relationship might be opposite or reversed. And there might be cross-level interactions. So in some cultures, for example, if meat plays a large role in status, for example, you would predict that it corresponds to the lower leading level, but in some other cultures it might not. So what you do when you aggregate data is also ignore the possibility of cross-level interactions occurring. So it's important also to highlight that these effects can exist in absence of a third variable problem. So you don't need to have a spurious relationship to be driving the effect. Just the mere process of you aggregating your data to a national or local or some other level can lead to this type of ecological fallacy or Simpson paradox types of effects. So even if we assume that the positive relationships at a state level or a national level translate to the lower level, then we might still be aggregating, the aggregation might have biased our effect size. And this is actually well known from studies in neuroscience and experimental psychology, that if you average across trials or you average across voxels, you can artificially inflate your effect sizes, making them seem much larger than they actually are. And just to show you an empirical example, turning to the pathogen stress hypothesis. So this is a paper by Scheller and Murray. And basically what they do is they investigate associations between pathogen stress and personality traits. And you find, I'm not sure whether this is readable, you find negative and relatively strong correlations between personality traits, extroversion and openness, and the degree of pathogens in your environment. The rationale being that it would be very beneficial to avoid seek out new experiences or to seek out new individuals because they might be able to infect you with pathogens. So it's better off to not have selection would act against these traits. That's the argument. So you find quite strong relationships at this macro level. But if you look at studies looking at individual level personality traits and perceived vulnerability to disease, so how individuals perceive themselves to be vulnerable to disease, you find much weaker relationships. So you find effects which are a fraction of the macro level relationship. So even if we assume that the relationship can translate, the effect sizes which are reported in these cross-cultural correlations are likely a lot weaker than at the individual level. And this is just a study looking at disgust sensitivity and personality traits. And again, it finds a lot weaker associations which are a lot weaker at the individual level than hypothesized at the macro level. So that was just one issue, the ecological fallacy and Simpson's paradox, and I think that's perhaps the most crucial one. The other one is non-independence. When you plot all these data points, you assume, so when we plotted the relationship between GDP and meat consumption, we assume that they're all independent, but actually they're not. And you have autocorrelation or Galton's problem or spatial correlation, whatever you want to call it. Basically, they're non-independent data points. And a lot of these studies don't control for these type of effects. They just report the raw correlation, assume not take into account the non-independence. So you get an inflated correlation coefficient, which is just a function of, for example, geographical location or cultural history being tagging along with your key variables of interest, or latitude or species diversity or whatever correlate is being included now in your correlation coefficient. Some people are wary of this. They've tried to control for regions or try to do the analysis within regions, but this doesn't solve it. So if we now say, oh, it must be, if we just take Europe and we still find the same positive relationship, then it must be something real. Obviously, this does not have to hold, because within a region, within Europe, the Netherlands is still closer related to Belgium than it is to Portugal. So it doesn't solve this type of problem, even though some of the authors of these papers argue that it does. And of course, I don't have to make this point in this particular room. Many solutions exist to dealing with this problem of non-independence data, but they've gone largely unrecognized in the field of cross-cultural correlations. They really just plot the data, not take into account the non-independence that you have. So you might look into geographic information systems, plotting the coordinates, You might use cultural history, you might weigh your data points, you might use linear mixed models or some other approach, but you have to deal with this non-independence. Now, the final point is equivalency of measurement. In our example, you can imagine that meat consumption might be measured differentially across the world. So in some cultures, it might involve fish. In some other cultures, it might not involve fish. And this might influence the estimates that we get. Also, in some cultures, it might include bushmeat, and in some other cultures, it might not include bushmeat. And this might all bias the estimates that you get for your relationship. And particularly, and this is well known in psychology, you might get the reference group effect. So basically, if we ask people how tall they are on a 1 to 9 scale based on their own population, you'll get the perfectly same aggregate in the population from Thailand as in the Netherlands, even though the Dutch are on average taller than the people from Thailand. So just using this type of subjective measures, for example, like how diseased are you compared to other people, will lead to this type of problems with reference group effects. Now, to be fair, many of these studies tend to rely on objective measures. So homicides, health inequality is based on published measures, and they tend to rely on the CIA World Factbook or the United Nations Development Program. Again, not all of them. So some of them just rely on personality measures, which are not objective measures. And I think it's important to point out that even in these widely used sources, there are substantial problems with errors. So this is just a paper by Wolf, Chong, and Aufheimer, and they focus on the Human Development Index, which is what you use to classify countries based on development. And they basically show that 34% of the cultures or countries are misclassified. And when you control for this, up to 100% of the parameter estimates from previous economics papers are potentially flawed. So even in sources which we think are quite standardized and documented quite well, such as the CIA World Factbook, I could talk about homicides as well. Like there could be problems in what if every country has a different notion of what a homicide is, and some of them like to juke their stats slightly, then you're going to get biased estimates. So I would encourage people working with cross-cultural relations to take a step back and think about measurement equivalency and the degree to which data is measured in the same way. So to conclude, I wanted to highlight 3 key issues with inferences based on cross-cultural correlations. And I think this limits the inferences we can make on human nature or on adaptation at the individual level based from these macro-level data. And I'm especially concerned when these are presented as a sole source of evidence. So sometimes you have papers putting forward a hypothesis and predominantly relying on these macro-level cross-cultural correlations. I also feel that new analytical techniques such as tree building or linear mixed models have been underutilized. People still rely on just raw cross-cultural correlations to show these associations between traits. Should those working on cross-cultural correlations or those working on a pathogen stress hypothesis or those working on in these areas despair? No, actually not, because more and more we're getting access to high-quality, longitudinal, comparable cross-cultural data, which actually allows you to investigate your hypotheses at the individual level, which I think is what we care about when we speak about adaptations in my field, evolution and human behavior. So this is all I wanted to cover, and I would like to thank you.